At his mother's funeral, while Jonathan Reed stood silently beside the casket that held the woman who raised him alone after his father abandoned them, his wife of 12 years, Victoria, whispered the words that would shatter what remained of his grieving heart. She wanted a divorce because he was too poor, because she deserved better, because his boss, the wealthy and powerful Richard Castellano, had promised her the life Jonathan could never provide. Jonathan's hands trembled as he held his mother's final letter, the seal still unbroken, while Victoria's lover, Marcus Chen, his supposed best friend and business partner at Castellano Industries, stood in the back of the chapel with a smirk that said he'd already won. But neither Victoria nor Marcus knew that the envelope Jonathan clutched contained not just his mother's goodbye, but the keys to a $500 million fortune and the secret truth that Jonathan's mother was actually Evelyn Reed, the silent majority shareholder of Castellano Industries, the very company where Marcus worked, the very empire that would now belong to her son. Jonathan looked at his three children, 8-year-old Sophie, 6-year-old Ethan, and 4-year-old Grace, standing confused in their black funeral clothes, unaware that their mother had already packed their bags to move into Marcus's penthouse. But what Victoria didn't know, what would soon destroy everything she thought she'd secured, was that Jonathan had discovered the paternity test hidden in her office, revealing that not one of those children carried his blood, that Sophie belonged to Marcus, that Ethan was the son of another wealthy married man, and that Grace was the daughter of Richard Castellano himself. As Victoria handed Jonathan the divorce papers right there beside his mother's casket, demanding he sign immediately so she could marry his boss without delay, Jonathan's grief transformed into something else, something cold and calculated, because the funeral she chose to destroy him at would become the birthplace of a revenge so methodical, so devastating, that it would strip her and her lovers of everything, their wealth, their reputations, their freedom, their futures. But would Jonathan's 15 levels of calculated vengeance be enough to heal the wound of raising children who were never his, of loving a wife who had betrayed him with not just one man, but 3, of losing his mother on the same day he discovered his entire life had been a lie? And when Victoria finally realized that the poor, weak husband she discarded at his mother's funeral was actually the man who now controlled her lover's career, her boss's company, and every secret she'd tried to bury, would her desperate attempts to win him back only accelerate her own destruction? Jonathan's fingers traced the wax seal on his mother's envelope as the funeral director's voice droned on about eternal rest and peaceful journeys, but all he could hear was Victoria's sharp whisper, still echoing in his ears, the divorce demand she'd made just moments ago beside his mother's casket. The chapel held maybe 40 people, most of them his mother's colleagues from her years working as what everyone believed was a simple executive assistant. But Jonathan noticed several men in expensive suits he'd never seen before, their presence oddly reverent for a woman who supposedly lived modestly. He thought about his mother's stories, the 50 tales she'd told him throughout his life about his grandmother's marriage, how his grandfather had cheated with 5 different women, fathering children his grandmother raised, believing they were hers until the devastating truth emerged at a family gathering when Jonathan was 12. His mother had explained how that betrayal shaped her, how watching her own mother's kindness exploited taught her to hide her true worth, to appear humble while building something real beneath the surface. She'd told him about his great-grandmother, too, who discovered her husband had an entire second family, 3 children she knew nothing about until his funeral, and how that woman had rebuilt her life through shrewd investments no one suspected she was capable of making. Victoria sat 3 rows back now, her black dress more cocktail attire than morning wear, and Jonathan caught her glancing at her phone every few minutes, probably texting Marcus about their timeline for moving forward. Jonathan remembered how they'd met 13 years ago at a charity gala, how her smile had seemed so genuine, how she'd told him about her own parents' marriage, her father's 3 affairs that her mother forgave because she feared being alone, how Victoria swore she'd never tolerate that kind of betrayal. She'd shared story after story during their courtship about her grandmother's experience, discovering her children belonged to different men, about her aunt's divorce after learning her husband had fathered twins with his secretary, about her mother's sister who raised 4 children only to discover at her husband's deathbed that 2 were from his affair with her best friend. Victoria had cried telling these stories, had clutched Jonathan's hand, and promised their marriage would be different, built on honesty and loyalty. He'd believed her completely, had trusted every tear and every promise. Marcus stood near the back exit, checking his Rolex, the same watch Jonathan had helped him pick out 3 years ago when Marcus got promoted to senior vice president at Castellano Industries. They'd been friends since college, roommates who'd supported each other through failed relationships and career struggles, and Marcus had spent countless nights at Jonathan's house, playing with the children, eating Victoria's cooking, accepting Jonathan's help with everything from job applications to relationship advice. Jonathan recalled Marcus sharing his own family history, how his parents' marriage crumbled when his mother discovered his father had children with 2 other women, how his grandfather had similarly betrayed his grandmother with multiple affairs that produced children raised in the same neighborhood. Marcus had seemed damaged by these stories, had sworn he'd never become that kind of man, had thanked Jonathan repeatedly for being the kind of friend and example he needed. The funeral director finally stopped talking, and people began filing past the casket for final goodbyes. Jonathan waited until the chapel emptied, except for him and the envelope that now felt impossibly heavy in his hands. He broke the seal and pulled out documents that made his breath catch: legal papers, stock certificates, bank statements, and a letter in his mother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Jonathan," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and it's time you learned the truth about who your mother really was." The letter explained how she'd been Evelyn Reed before taking her maiden name back after Jonathan's father left, how she'd built a technology empire through strategic investments starting 30 years ago, how she'd maintained the appearance of modest employment while secretly holding 53% of Castellano Industries, making her the silent majority shareholder who could control everything with a single vote. She explained that Richard Castellano knew her true identity, had tried multiple times to buy her out or seduce her into marriage for control, and how she'd refused every attempt. Jonathan's hands shook as he read about his mother's own past, how she'd been married before his father, how that first husband had cheated with 7 different women, how she'd discovered children from those affairs scattered across 3 states, how that betrayal had taught her to never show her full hand again. She documented watching her mother endure similar pain, her grandmother before that, a generational pattern of women betrayed by men who hid children in double lives. But she'd broken that pattern by building power in secret, by appearing weak while becoming stronger than anyone suspected. The final paragraph made Jonathan's blood run cold. "I've known about Victoria for 6 years, about Marcus for 4, about the children's true paternity since each was born. I've documented everything. The evidence is in my safe deposit box, key enclosed. I waited because I wanted you to learn strength through hardship first. To understand kindness doesn't mean weakness. Now take what's yours and show them what happens when they mistake gentleness for foolishness. The company, the fortune, the proof, it's all yours now. Use it wisely." Jonathan drove to the bank the morning after the funeral, his mother's key clutched in his hand like a weapon he didn't yet know how to wield. Victoria had stayed at the house long enough to pack 3 suitcases and inform the children she'd be back for them when she got settled, a phrase that made 8-year-old Sophie cry and 6-year-old Ethan punch the wall in his bedroom. 4-year-old Grace had simply stared at Jonathan with eyes that suddenly seemed like a stranger's, and he'd felt his heart crack, knowing what he'd read in his mother's letter about their true parentage. The bank manager, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd apparently known his mother well, escorted him to a private room where the safe deposit box waited. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman," Patricia said softly, and Jonathan heard something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she said. She prepared extensively for this day. The box contained 6 thick folders, each labeled with names and dates. The first folder was marked Victoria Reed, Complete History, and held documents that painted a picture Jonathan had been blind to for over a decade. Private investigator reports detailed Victoria's affairs starting just 6 months after their wedding, beginning with a wealthy real estate developer named Thomas Whitmore, who'd gotten her pregnant with Sophie. The reports included hotel receipts, photographs, text messages, and a paternity test dated 2 weeks after Sophie's birth, showing zero genetic match to Jonathan. His mother had known from the beginning, had watched him raise another man's child with love and devotion while collecting evidence. The folder contained Victoria's own family history too, evidence his mother had compiled showing Victoria's mother had done the same thing to her father, passing off 3 children who belonged to other men, and how Victoria's grandmother had perfected this pattern before her. The investigators' notes suggested this wasn't coincidence but learned behavior, a deliberate strategy Victoria had inherited and refined. The second folder contained Marcus's files, and Jonathan's nausea intensified as he read about his best friend's calculated infiltration of his life. Marcus had deliberately befriended him in college after researching his family, had learned about Jonathan's mother's hidden wealth through connections Marcus's own mother had in financial circles, and had targeted Jonathan specifically to gain access to that world. The affair with Victoria had started 3 years into Jonathan's marriage, producing Ethan, and the paternity test confirmed Marcus's biological connection. But the folder revealed something worse. Marcus had been feeding information to Richard Castellano about Jonathan's mother, helping Castellano try to identify the mysterious majority shareholder, never realizing the sweet elderly woman who sometimes visited Jonathan's home was the target they sought. Marcus's own history mirrored the betrayal, his father having deceived his mother similarly, his grandfather notorious for children scattered across 4 states, and the psychological profile suggested Marcus saw this as normal behavior, even admirable cunning. The third folder focused on Richard Castellano, and Jonathan's stomach turned as he read about his boss's affair with Victoria, the one that produced Grace, barely 4 years old and completely innocent in all this. Castellano had seduced Victoria at a company holiday party, had continued the relationship knowing she was married to one of his employees, had apparently enjoyed the power dynamic of sleeping with Jonathan's wife while Jonathan worked overtime on projects Castellano assigned. The folder contained evidence of 17 other affairs Castellano had conducted with employees' wives, a pattern of predatory behavior his own father had modeled, his grandfather before that, men who'd built empires while destroying families. Castellano's 3 ex-wives had all divorced him, citing infidelity, and he'd fathered at least 12 children outside his marriages, paying settlements that kept most cases quiet. The investigators' notes suggested Castellano saw this as his right as a powerful man, something his family history had normalized across 4 generations. Jonathan found additional folders documenting Victoria's 2 other affairs during their marriage. One with a married doctor who'd performed her cosmetic procedures, another with a venture capitalist she'd met through Marcus. Both relationships overlapping in a timeline that showed Victoria had rarely been faithful for more than a few months at a stretch. Each folder contained similar generational patterns, families where infidelity and deception had been passed down like heirlooms, where women learned to secure financial futures through strategic pregnancies, where men treated marriage vows as suggestions rather than commitments. His mother's notes suggested she'd investigated all these people because she'd seen the patterns in her own family history, repeating, had recognized Victoria's behavior from her own grandmother's stories about women who weaponized pregnancy and manipulated paternity, and had wanted Jonathan to understand this wasn't personal failure, but generational dysfunction he'd stumbled into. The final folder contained his mother's strategic plan, 15 specific steps she'd outlined for destroying everyone who'd betrayed him. Each step was methodical, legal, and devastating, designed to use their own greed and assumptions against them. Jonathan read through the revenge roadmap his mother had created, seeing how she'd positioned every piece over years, how she'd waited for her death to trigger the transfer of power that would give him control over everything his enemies valued. The plan's brilliance lay in its patience, its understanding that true revenge wasn't quick retaliation, but systematic dismantling. Jonathan returned home that evening to find Victoria waiting in the living room with Marcus, both of them wearing expressions that mixed impatience with barely concealed contempt. The children were at Victoria's mother's house, spared from witnessing what would come next, and Jonathan felt grateful for that small mercy, even as rage burned through his chest. Victoria stood first, smoothing her dress in a gesture that once seemed elegant, but now struck him as calculated performance. "We need to discuss the settlement," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the tone she used when explaining things to the children. "Marcus and I have consulted with attorneys, and given your financial situation, we're willing to be reasonable about asset division." Marcus nodded from the couch, his posture relaxed in Jonathan's home, sitting on furniture Jonathan had bought, in a house Jonathan's paychecks had paid for, while Marcus seduced his wife and fathered his son. Jonathan pulled out his phone and made the first call, reaching his mother's attorney, a shark named Catherine Walsh, who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Ms. Walsh, this is Jonathan Reed, Evelyn's son. I'm ready to execute the transfer of shares and assume my position as majority shareholder of Castellano Industries. Please file the paperwork immediately and schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." He watched Victoria's face drain of color as understanding began creeping in, watched Marcus sit up straight as confusion replaced smugness. "Also, please ensure Richard Castellano receives formal notice that his position as CEO is subject to shareholder review, effective immediately, and that Marcus Chen's employment is suspended pending investigation into corporate espionage and breach of fiduciary duty." Catherine's voice came through the speaker, crisp and delighted. "Consider it done, Jonathan. Your mother prepared extensively for this. I'll have security escort Mr. Castellano from the building tonight, and Mr. Chen's access will be revoked within the hour. The preliminary injunctions freezing their assets are ready to file." Victoria found her voice first, shrill with panic. "What are you talking about? What shares? Your mother was an assistant. She had nothing." Jonathan smiled coldly, finally understanding his mother's lifetime of lessons about appearing weak while building strength. "My mother was Evelyn Reed, majority shareholder of Castellano Industries, worth approximately $500 million, and she left everything to me. The company where you work, Marcus, where you've been stealing proprietary information to sell to competitors, thinking you were betraying some nobody's trust, that company is mine now. The boss Victoria left me for, Richard Castellano, the man she had an affair with, the father of Grace. He's about to be fired by me, the poor husband she thought was beneath her." He turned to Marcus, voice dropping to something dangerous. "And you, my best friend, who spent years in my home, eating my food, playing with children you knew weren't mine, sleeping with my wife in hotels I'll now own since several are Castellano Industries properties. You're finished." Marcus stood, trying to recover his composure, falling back on the false friendship that had worked for years. "Jonathan, let's talk about this reasonably. Whatever you think happened, we can work it out. We're brothers, man. We've been through everything together." But Jonathan had read the folders, understood now that Marcus's entire friendship had been reconnaissance, a long con to access what Marcus thought was eventual inheritance, and that truth killed any lingering doubt about what came next. "We're not brothers. You're a stranger who studied my family, who befriended me specifically because your mother told you mine had money, who slept with my wife and fathered my son as part of some twisted strategy. My mother documented everything, Marcus. Every lie, every manipulation, every moment you pretended to be my friend while destroying my life." He made another call, this time to the district attorney's office, where his mother had apparently cultivated relationships. "This is Jonathan Reed. I have evidence of fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy that I'd like to present regarding Marcus Chen and Richard Castellano. My attorney will coordinate the details." Victoria tried pleading then, tears streaming down her face in a performance Jonathan had seen countless times, usually when she wanted something expensive or needed to cover some indiscretion he'd been too trusting to recognize. "Jonathan, please, think about the children. Sophie, Ethan, Grace. They need stability. Whatever problems we've had, we can fix this for their sake." Jonathan felt something inside him turn to ice, his mother's voice echoing in his memory. All those stories about women and men who'd betrayed their spouses, who'd passed off other people's children as their own, who'd exploited kindness as weakness. "The children," he said slowly, pulling out the paternity tests his mother had collected. "You mean Sophie Whitmore, daughter of Thomas and Victoria? Or Ethan Chen, son of Marcus and Victoria? Or perhaps Grace Castellano, daughter of Richard and Victoria? Those children?" He threw the papers on the coffee table, watched them scatter like the lies that had built his marriage. Victoria's tears stopped abruptly, calculation replacing panic in her eyes as she looked for an angle, some way to manipulate the situation. She'd grown up watching her mother do this, learning from her grandmother how to weaponize motherhood and leverage children for financial security, generations of women who'd perfected the art of strategic pregnancy and emotional blackmail. But Jonathan had learned something too, from his mother's patient example and careful planning. I've filed for legal separation with full documentation of adultery and paternity fraud. I'm pursuing annulment based on deception about the children's parentage. The house, the cars, the bank accounts, all in my name, all protected by prenuptial agreement you signed that specifically voided claims in case of infidelity. My mother's attorneys are very thorough. He stood, looking at both of them with something beyond anger, beyond hurt. And those children you mentioned, Victoria? I'm petitioning the court to remove my name from their birth certificates and terminate my parental rights. They have biological fathers who can support them, 3 wealthy men who made them and should raise them. The courtroom erupted 3 months later when Jonathan's attorney presented the evidence that had taken years to compile, documents and testimonies that painted a picture so devastating that even the judge seemed shaken by its scope. Catherine Walsh stood before the bench in her sharp navy suit, her voice cutting through the murmurs with surgical precision. Your Honor, what we have here isn't simply a case of marital infidelity, but systematic fraud spanning 12 years, involving multiple conspirators, resulting in financial damages exceeding $8 million in child support, medical expenses, and lifestyle costs for children the defendant knew were not biologically related to my client. Victoria sat at the defense table with her attorney, an expensive shark named Robert Morrison, who'd built his reputation on protecting wealthy women in divorce proceedings. But even Morrison looked uncomfortable as the evidence mounted. Marcus occupied another table with his own legal team, required to be present since he was named in fraud charges, and Richard Castellano sat in the gallery, already fired from his CEO position and fighting his own legal battles over corporate misconduct. Catherine displayed the first paternity test on the courtroom screens. Sophie's results showing 0 genetic match to Jonathan, but clear biological connection to Thomas Whitmore, the real estate developer who died in a car accident 2 years prior, leaving Sophie without her biological father's support or inheritance. Mrs. Reed engaged in an extramarital affair within 6 months of marriage, became pregnant, and deliberately deceived my client about the child's paternity. She accepted my client's name on the birth certificate, allowed him to pay all expenses, to provide emotional support and parenting, all while knowing he had no biological connection to this child. She clicked to the next slide, showing hospital bills totaling $400,000 for Sophie's various medical needs over 8 years, every dollar paid by Jonathan, while Victoria funneled money to secret accounts. The defendant's own mother engaged in similar behavior, passing off 3 children who weren't biologically related to her husband, learning this as an acceptable practice from her grandmother, who did the same. This isn't isolated misconduct, but generational fraud. Victoria's attorney objected repeatedly, trying to argue that emotional bonds outweighed biological connection, that Jonathan's willingness to parent the children created irrevocable responsibility, but Catherine had anticipated every angle. She presented Marcus's deposition, where he'd admitted under oath to deliberately befriending Jonathan in college, specifically because Marcus's mother had discovered information about Evelyn Reed's hidden wealth, to pursuing Victoria as part of a calculated plan to access that fortune through proxy, to fathering Ethan while maintaining the facade of best friendship. Mr. Chen's own testimony reveals conspiracy to defraud my client of both family and future inheritance. His father engaged in identical behavior, fathering children with 5 different women while married, teaching his son that this manipulation was acceptable, even admirable. She showed the court Marcus's emails to Victoria, messages where they discussed Jonathan as a useful fool and planned their future once they'd secured access to his mother's money. The testimony about Richard Castellano proved most damaging, as Catherine presented evidence of his 17 affairs with employees' wives, his pattern of targeting vulnerable marriages, and wielding his corporate power to facilitate infidelity. Mr. Castellano seduced the defendant at a company holiday party, began an affair that produced the child Grace, and continued this relationship while employing my client and benefiting from his work product. He knew Victoria was married to his employee, but saw this as entertainment, as his right as a powerful man. Learned from a father who'd done the same thing to dozens of families. From a grandfather who'd normalized this predatory behavior across 3 generations. Grace's paternity test appeared on screen, showing conclusive biological connection to Castellano, and Catherine noted that Grace would never know her biological father as anything but the man who destroyed her mother's marriage and abandoned his parental responsibilities. Victoria took the stand in her own defense, and Jonathan watched her perform the role she'd perfected, tearful and repentant, claiming she'd been confused and scared, that the affairs had been mistakes born of loneliness. But Catherine's cross-examination shredded this narrative, presenting bank records showing Victoria had opened secret accounts 6 months before Sophie's birth, had been planning financial independence while securing Jonathan as backup support. You weren't confused, were you, Mrs. Reed? You learned from your mother, who learned from her mother, that you could secure multiple income streams by having children with wealthy men while maintaining a marriage to someone stable. Your grandmother had affairs with 4 different men, producing children she passed off to her husband, setting up trust funds from the biological fathers while keeping her marriage intact. Your mother did the same with 3 men, and you simply expanded the strategy to include corporate targets like Mr. Rere Castellano. The defense crumbled further when Catherine presented evidence of Victoria's other affairs during the marriage. Relationships with a married cosmetic surgeon and a venture capitalist, both men who'd provided gifts and money Victoria had hidden in accounts Jonathan never knew existed. The defendant maintained 4 simultaneous relationships, each carefully managed to maximize financial benefit while minimizing risk of discovery. She scheduled her pregnancies strategically, ensuring each child had a wealthy biological father who could be leveraged for support if needed, while maintaining my client as primary caregiver, who believed these children were his. The surgeon's deposition revealed Victoria had offered him an abortion unless he paid $50,000, which he had, and that she'd had similar conversations with the venture capitalist, essentially extorting money from her lovers while appearing devoted to her marriage. Jonathan's testimony came last, and Catherine had coached him to remain calm, factual, letting the evidence speak rather than his emotion. He described the moment at his mother's funeral when Victoria demanded divorce, how she'd handed him papers beside his mother's casket and declared him too poor to deserve her, how Marcus had stood in the back of the chapel, smirking about their plans. He explained finding his mother's letter and evidence, the revelation that he'd raised 3 children who shared none of his DNA, that his marriage had been built entirely on deception. I love those children, he said quietly, seeing Victoria's hope flare that this admission might save her. I would have continued loving them if my wife had been honest, if we could have built something real. But she used them as weapons, as leverage, as proof of her successful manipulation. She told me the day she left that Sophie was proof she could do better than me, that Ethan and Grace were evidence that real men wanted her. She didn't see them as children, but as trophies from her conquests. The judge's ruling came swift and absolute, informed by overwhelming evidence and clear legal precedent. Victoria's claims to any portion of Jonathan's inheritance were dismissed, the prenuptial agreement upheld, and she was ordered to repay $4 million in fraudulently obtained support. Jonathan's name would be removed from all 3 birth certificates, his parental rights and responsibilities terminated, and Victoria would be required to pursue support from the biological fathers or their estates. Marcus faced criminal charges for corporate espionage and civil liability for fraud, his assets frozen pending resolution. Richard Castellano, already ousted from his company, faced additional lawsuits from shareholders and other victims of his predatory behavior. The judge's final words echoed through the courtroom. This case represents calculated, multi-generational fraud that exploited trust, kindness, and legal protections meant to protect children and families. The defendant will face consequences proportional to her decade of deception. 6 months after the trial, Jonathan stood in the executive office that had once belonged to Richard Castellano, now renovated to reflect his mother's aesthetic rather than the aggressive masculinity his predecessor had favored. The city sprawled below him, 40 stories of power and possibility that his mother had built, while everyone assumed she was merely someone's assistant, someone's modest widow, someone who didn't matter. He'd implemented 12 of his mother's 15 revenge steps so far, each one surgically precise in its devastation. Castellano Industries had become Reed Technologies under his leadership, renamed to honor his mother's legacy, and the company's value had increased 30% after he'd fired the executives who'd participated in Castellano's toxic culture. Richard Castellano himself was bankrupt, his golden parachute voided by breach of ethics clauses Jonathan's mother had quietly inserted into contracts years ago. Facing lawsuits from 17 families he'd damaged and criminal charges for securities fraud Catherine's team had uncovered during discovery. Marcus Chen's destruction had been particularly satisfying to watch unfold. The corporate espionage charges had led to federal investigation, revealing Marcus had sold proprietary information to 3 different competitors, earning millions in kickbacks while pretending to be Jonathan's loyal friend. His assets were seized, his reputation in the industry destroyed, and his own family had turned on him when they discovered his crimes. Marcus's father, contacted during the investigation, had expressed no surprise, had actually laughed and said his son had learned from the best, revealing yet another generation of men who saw betrayal as business strategy. Marcus was currently serving a 5-year sentence in federal prison, and Jonathan had ensured that everyone in Marcus's former social circle knew exactly why, ending any chance of reputation recovery upon release. Victoria's fall had been even more comprehensive because she'd had further to fall and more people to lose in the process. The $4 million judgment had forced her to liquidate everything, and when that proved insufficient, Catherine had pursued garnishment of future earnings, ensuring Victoria would spend decades repaying her fraud. But the financial ruin was almost secondary to the social destruction that followed when the trial's details went public. Victoria's mother had disowned her, publicly stating she taught her daughter better values and was ashamed of what Victoria had become. A statement that rang hollow given the family history, but still cut Victoria off from her primary support system. Victoria's friends, mostly wives of executives and wealthy professionals, had turned on her instantly, seeing her as a threat to their own marriages, someone whose behavior could contaminate their social standing. The exclusive clubs had revoked her memberships, the charities had declined her continued involvement, and she'd been forced to move from their affluent suburb to a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew her story. The children's situation had proven most complicated emotionally, even as Jonathan maintained his legal and practical boundaries. Sophie, at 9 years old, had been old enough to understand some of what happened, and she'd written him a letter that Catherine had advised him not to open, saying it would only complicate matters. He'd opened it anyway, read her confused questions about why he didn't love her anymore, why she couldn't call him daddy, why everything had changed. He'd cried reading it, had nearly weakened, but his mother's voice in his memory reminded him that keeping those children in his life meant funding Victoria's fraud forever, meant accepting a role built on lies, meant teaching them that deception had no real consequences. Sophie now lived with Victoria and saw Thomas Whitmore's brother occasionally, a man trying to connect with his deceased brother's child, but struggling with the complicated circumstances. Ethan, at 7, apparently asked about Jonathan constantly, and Marcus's parents had reluctantly accepted visitation obligations, their grandson a living reminder of their son's crimes. Grace, barely 5, would grow up never knowing Jonathan had once believed he was her father, would be told some sanitized version of the story that protected her from the ugliest truths. Richard Castellano had been forced by court order to establish a trust for her, providing financial support while maintaining no personal contact, an arrangement that seemed to suit him fine. Jonathan had ensured the trust was substantial, using his power over Castellano to extract resources for the innocent child, even while destroying her biological father's life. It wasn't the child's fault her parents were moral disasters, and he'd found he could separate her well-being from his need for revenge against those who'd created her through betrayal. His mother's 15th step had actually been about this, about ensuring the children had resources independent of their toxic parents, a final act of kindness that didn't compromise the justice she'd planned. The final 3 steps of his mother's revenge plan had been the most creative: targeting the generational patterns that had enabled everyone's behavior. Jonathan had established a foundation in his mother's name focused on paternity fraud awareness, funding legal aid for men discovering similar betrayals, and lobbying for laws requiring genetic testing at birth. The foundation's first major case had been filed just last week, representing a man whose wife had admitted after 15 years that their 3 children weren't his, and Jonathan had personally funded the legal team, ensuring that case set precedent. He'd given interviews about his experience, carefully framed to avoid violating court orders, but speaking openly about the emotional devastation of raising children built on lies, and the interviews had gone viral, sparking national conversation about deception, trust, and the asymmetries in family law. The second step involved restructuring Reed Technologies' corporate culture completely, implementing policies that protected families and penalized executives who preyed on employees or their spouses. Jonathan had fired 18 additional executives during this process, men who'd learned from Castellano that affairs with subordinates and their families were perks of power, and he'd promoted women and younger professionals into their positions, people hungry for change and willing to build something better. The company's reputation had shifted dramatically, becoming known as a place that valued integrity, and Jonathan had poached top talent from competitors who wanted to work somewhere that matched their values. His mother would have been proud of this transformation, he thought, seeing her company become what she'd always intended rather than what men like Castellano had corrupted it into. The 15th and final step was personal, the one his mother had labeled moving forward in her notes. Jonathan had started dating again, carefully and cautiously, meeting people through work and social connections, being honest about his past and watching how they reacted. Most relationships fizzled quickly when women realized how damaged his trust had become, how thoroughly Victoria's betrayal had rewired his ability to be vulnerable. But he'd met someone recently who understood. A woman named Sarah Mitchell, who'd experienced similar betrayal in her own marriage and had rebuilt her life with the same combination of strength and caution. They were taking things slowly, both of them wary and wounded, but willing to try trusting again. His mother's note had reminded him that revenge without recovery was just bitterness, that destroying his enemies meant nothing if he didn't eventually build something new. Standing in his office with the city below him and his mother's letter framed on the wall, Jonathan understood finally what she'd been teaching him through all those stories about their family history, about generations of betrayal and women who'd had to be harder than the world around them. She'd spent his whole life preparing him for the possibility that kindness would be exploited, that trust might be weaponized, that he might need to be steel-wrapped in softness to survive. Victoria had mistaken his gentleness for weakness, had assumed his devotion meant he could be used indefinitely, had calculated wrong about who held real power. Marcus had confused friendship with opportunity, had thought Jonathan was a stepping stone to something greater, never realizing he was actually approaching someone stronger than himself. Castellano had seen an employee he could manipulate, a husband he could humiliate by sleeping with the man's wife, never suspecting that the silent shareholder he'd spent years trying to identify was that employee's mother. They'd all made the same mistake, had confused appearing ordinary with actually being ordinary, had mistaken kindness for stupidity and patience for passivity. Jonathan's revenge hadn't been hot and impulsive, but cold and systematic, each step building on the last, using their own greed and assumptions to destroy them completely. They'd lost everything while he'd gained everything, and the reversal was so complete that sometimes he still felt surprised by how thoroughly his mother had positioned him to win. The inheritance, the evidence, the legal strategies, the corporate control. She'd built a machine for justice and left him the keys, trusting he'd learned enough from her stories and their years together to use it properly. Victoria had called last week, breaking the no-contact order, leaving a voicemail begging him to reconsider his relationship with the children, saying they needed him, that he was the only father they'd ever really known. He'd listened to the message once, heard the desperation in her voice, the reality that she'd destroyed everything trying to trade up from a good man to wealthy men, and now had neither stability nor status. He deleted it without responding because his mother's final lesson had been about this exact moment, about the inevitability that Victoria would eventually understand what she'd lost and try to manipulate him back into position. When they finally see what they destroyed, his mother had written, they'll try to use your kindness against you one last time. Don't let them. You were kind before because you didn't know better. Now you know, and you can be kind to others who deserve it while remaining steel to those who prove they don't. Jonathan turned from the window as Catherine entered with another folder, this one containing information about Victoria's latest attempt to appeal the judgment, an appeal that would fail like all the others because the evidence was irrefutable and the law was clear. He felt nothing looking at the papers, no anger or satisfaction or regret, just the calm certainty that he'd done what was necessary, what was just, what his mother had prepared him for across his entire life. The story she told him about kindness and betrayal had turned out to be his story, but unlike the tragic endings in his family's history, unlike the generations of people who'd been destroyed by others' selfishness, his story ended with him standing in an office built on his mother's legacy, holding power his enemies had never suspected existed, having cast out the lies disguised as family and rebuilt his life on truth. That was the final revenge, he realized. Not just destroying them, but surviving and thriving while they crumbled, proving that kindness backed by strength was more powerful than their calculated cruelty ever could be.